You are listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I am Adam Young, and I am joined today by Cathy Loerzel. Cathy, it's good to see you. Welcome back.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Here's the purpose of today's episode. It's really twofold. First, we want to talk big picture about why it's necessary to understand your story. In other words, why it's so important to do story work. And then second, we want to tell you about a step you can take to continue working on your story, or to start if you haven't. And namely, that step is to participate in an upcoming workshop that we are doing called Understanding Your Story, which will take place via Zoom on Saturday, November 19th. So first, let's talk about why it's so essential to understand your story. And I want to share 3 reasons, and then we will flesh each of them out in more depth. Why is it so important to do the work to understand your story? Number 1, it is the single most important thing you can do to experience healing. Number 2, it's the only way to stop reenacting your past harm and therefore hurting the people, often the people that you love the most, spouse, children, friends. And number 3, it's the best way, story work, engaging your story is the best way to understand your kingdom and your purpose on earth, what you are to be about here on planet Earth. So those are the 3 reasons just stated. Now we'll flesh them out. We'll talk about them in more depth. The first reason that you need to understand your story is because understanding your story is very important for you to experience healing. It's important to remember that we are created for shalom, which means that each person is created to feel at peace inside our body, at peace interpersonally, like in our relationships, and at peace with God. That's how human beings are designed to function. You're not created for anxiety, emotional pain, relationship problems, hopelessness. But the place we find ourselves is living in a fractured, broken world. And as a result, we do have anxiety. We do have emotional pain. We do have relationships that are struggling. And you probably, if you're like me, feel some hopelessness in certain areas of your life. So here's the point. Who among us is not in need of healing? Our brains, our hearts, our bodies are wounded, which begs the question, how do our brains, hearts, and bodies heal? And in my experience, the one thing that has brought the most healing for me is simply this. It's understanding my story, the story of my life in especially my family of origin, the experiences that I've had living on this earth.
And I think, me too. And as we step into our stories, I think it's also important to understand how evil has attended to our stories to keep us bound to our trauma, to keep us bound to our past, and to really take us out of what we were created, what we were meant to bring to this world. And each of us has a calling, not to necessarily do big, huge things, but we have a calling to create beauty and goodness in our lives. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But it's really important because evil has set us up from the beginning to try to thwart that, to try to keep us bound to hopelessness, to despair. We can't experience freedom because we haven't gone back to understand, 1, where our stories have been bound in the first place, and then 2, how evil has then attended to that over time.
And if you're like me, you've probably tried stuff already, lots of things to get help and healing. You've read books, you've gone to conferences, you've spent time in prayer earnestly, and maybe you've even done therapy. And it can feel exhausting to try very, very hard to experience healing and then not find the breakthrough that we're wanting. It's just not right for someone to want to experience healing and freedom, and for someone to have the willingness and the courage and the honesty to do whatever is necessary, to do the work, whatever is necessary for healing, and yet for that person to not be able to find the healing, the freedom, the breath, the spaciousness that they're looking for. That's just not right. And so let me also say this. I know I know you also, Cathy, know like what it's like. We know what it's like to struggle with emotional problems, with relationship problems, with marriage problems, with heartache raising children, all of that stuff. We understand what it's like to try everything from therapy to books to prayer and still feel stuck. So I think it's important. It's important for me to say that this story work stuff, it's not academic for me. It's not my job. Cathy and I are doing this because it has helped us find healing and freedom when nothing else has worked. And it's not merely, that you and I, Cathy, have experienced healing ourselves. Like we've watched a lot of people who felt confusion, hopelessness, exhaustion, despair, experience genuine healing and freedom by doing their own story work, by understanding their own narrative. So, summary of point number one, understanding your story is the single most important thing you can do for your brain, your heart, your body to heal from the wounds of living in a broken world. That's number one. Second reason to do your own story work is this. It is really a requirement if you want to stop reenacting your past harm and therefore hurting the people that you love the most. So will you unpack this one, Cathy? What do we mean by reenacting your past harm?
Yeah, this is a hard one and a personal one because I just went through a reenactment of my past harm in my marriage like yesterday. So I think it's important to look at this twofold. One is that when we talk about healing, we're not talking about being able to then avoid suffering or avoiding harm or all of a sudden living in active shalom all the time because all of a sudden our world stops falling apart. No, the world will continue to stay broken. It will continue to stay hard. But the point is becoming a person who is grounded enough, who is solid enough, where when the swirl happens, when the mistakes occur, when we find ourselves in these old narratives, we have enough capacity to stop, to settle our bodies, and then to allow ourselves to have do-overs. You can't do that if you're blind to why whatever's happening around you is happening in the first place. Or you're not going to have enough wisdom or connection to your past trauma, to what you're trying to avoid in the moment. So basically, reenactment is this wonderful thing and horrible thing where what we experienced as harm in the past, we have created workarounds to try to avoid that feeling again. And so when we have unaddressed trauma, it's almost like a foretold prophecy that you're going to do it again and again and again until you actually are healed from that thing, even though you're working tirelessly to try to avoid it. So for me, that happens in my marriage all the time, where I'll go into a conversation with my husband that I know is fraught with our DMZs, your demilitarized zones, right? Where you've both agreed you're going to stay out of the fray. You don't want to go back into these conversations again. You don't want to set off the same landmines. So, I'll go, this is usually around for us where I don't want to, I want the house clean. I want things put away. I don't like clutter. So I'll come home from a trip. I'll come home from the day and there's clutter all around. And so I try to go to him 5 different ways to basically have the conversation of, can you please pick up after yourself? Right? But you hear my tone. I want something from him. So I'll go into that conversation thinking, okay, I'm going to do it better this time. I am going to go to him and ask really kindly and be like, hey, babe, I noticed the dishes aren't done and I'm wondering if you could maybe but this is what I'll do. Were you planning on doing the dishes or, did you think I was going to do the dishes or the magical person that comes out at night, an elf that lives somewhere that does it for us, right? So you can hear the sarcasm in my voice. I'm trying to not have a reenactment, but I can't avoid it, right? Because the end of that story, he gets reactive. I then get reactive. And now we're reenacting the same fight that we've had for 11 years of our marriage. it's going to get reenacted unless I understand where that comes from in my own story. And so for me, when I'm anxious, when I feel dysregulated or undone, when I can't control my inside anxiety, I want my external world to be orderly. I want the kitchen clean because that gives me a semblance of order. It gives me a semblance of something that makes sense, that can feel clean, that can feel put away, finished. But really, it's my internal anxiety that needs tending to. It's the internal part of me that learned a long time ago that I couldn't handle all the chaos going around me in my family of origin. So my external world needed to be ordered. That little girl in me needs care, needs settling. And then I won't be reenacting that drama with my husband over and over again because I'm actually going to come at that conversation from a more healed way. And so when we talk about reenactment, that's what we're talking about. How your past trauma that's unaddressed is reenacting itself in the present, but you feel hopeless in the midst of it because you feel like you don't have any agency to change it. And you try to change it 50 different ways, but you always end up in the same cul-de-sac. What we're saying, the cul-de-sac is always going to be there unless you deal with the origin story that has created that cul-de-sac within your marriage, within your life, and actually get you back onto, even if it's a country road, like Lord have mercy. I'd rather potholes on a country road than that same cul-de-sac that we've been living in for the last 11 years.
So that's reason number 2 for doing story work, reenactments. The third reason to do your own story work, and I'm sure there are more than these 3, but these were the first 3 that came to mind, is that understanding your story will allow you to know something about who you have been created to be and what you have been put on earth to do. In other words, understanding your story will give you clues about what we call your kingdom. And if you want to know more about what I mean here, you can go back and listen to podcast episode 34, which is titled Your Kingdom, the Purpose of Counseling. Here's a summary of that episode. Healing is not an end in itself. The goal of life is not to heal from your wounds. Healing is meant to catapult you into the world to become the person that God created you to be so that you can rule the kingdom God has entrusted to your care. And you cannot know what your kingdom is until you understand your story. Why? Because the way the world works is that God takes what evil intended for your harm, which you will uncover in your story, and creates goodness and beauty and, frankly, authority in you out of that harm. According to Jesus, it is only the truth that will set you free. In order for your brain to heal, you have to name the truth of your story, or said better, your stories, because we all have many, many stories. And some of the stories that you have are stories of harm. They're stories of heartache. They're stories of being wounded. So one of my favorite passages of scripture that has been so pivotal for me in understanding story work is Jeremiah 6, and it's repeated in Jeremiah 8, where God gets angry with the leaders of Israel for not taking the wounds of the people seriously. And this is what God says: prophets and priests alike, that is the leadership, all practice deceit. They dress the wound of my people as though it were not serious. Peace, peace, they say, when there is no peace. So God's angry with the leaders of his people because the leaders are treating the wounds of the people as though those wounds were no big deal. They're saying, peace, peace, everything's fine, when everything is not fine. Now, here's what's sad for so many of us. We are like the leaders of Israel, but with regard to our own wounds. We often do not take our own wounds seriously. We treat them as though they were small, inconsequential, and not really affecting us. And how do we do it? Peace, peace, we say. Everything's fine. That was 30 years ago. We have lots of ways of dismissing wounds that are actually in need of care and attention. And even though we say peace, peace, very often there is no peace in our bodies. We have symptoms. We have anxieties. We have fears. We have depression. We have relationship problems, problems with God. There's lots and lots of ways in which our bodies are saying, it is not well with me. So, engaging your story, understanding your story, particularly your story in your family growing up, is a huge part of what is required for healing. So let me summarize. Oh, do you want to say you're raising your hand?
No, well, what struck me about what you just said, you've taught on this passage a lot, and what caught me this time when you're reading it is that for those leaders, the reason why they needed to say peace, peace when there is no peace is because they were not willing to look at themselves. They were not willing to understand their own wounds, their own impact on other people, and be able to actually do the courageous effort of self-reflection, of understanding both their own harm, where they've harmed, their impact. And I think that's the point of all of this, right? Is that we're either the leaders who are saying peace, peace when there is no peace because we're not actually looking at our own wounding or what's going on underneath the surface, or we're the people in the community where other people are saying to us, hey, your wounds are, just play the part. Don't make a big deal about this, and don't be so dramatic about when your body starts to get reactive, right? And so I think it's important to look at both, because as leaders, as priests and prophets and kings and queens, if we want to move into calling, we have to be willing to do the difficult work of understanding our own hearts and our own, because the places that we've been harmed will also be the places we're most protective, and then also the places where we'll probably harm the most to other people that we're engaging with.
So, summary of the 3 reasons why it's a really good idea to do the work to understand your story. Number 1, it is the single most important thing you can do to experience healing, and not just healing, but frankly growth, maturation, becoming a more mature and true you. Number 2, it is the only way to stop reenacting your past harm and therefore hurting the people that you care about. And number 3, it is the best way to understand your kingdom and your purpose on earth. So that's kind of a short version of our pitch for why it's a good idea for you to carve out time to continue doing your story work, or to start. Cathy, will you share an overview of the workshop, the schedule for the workshop? What can people expect if they sign up for Saturday, November 19th, Understanding Your Story workshop? What are we going to do?
So, we'll start out with the basics of trauma. What is trauma? How it affects you? How to know if you've experienced it. And then we'll move on to understanding how the trauma that has impacted you, how that relates to your family of origin. Most trauma doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so when you can say this was harm that happened, it has something to do with your family of origin. And then Adam, you'll go into the big 6, which are things that every child needs from their parents. I love the big 6. I think it's super helpful because you start to see what we're meant for versus just what was missing. And oftentimes we get a clearer sense of what happened within our family of origin when we get a sense of what good would have looked like. So I think that's really helpful. And then you'll go into, again, the objections of what may come up as you explore your story. A lot of people, especially within the Christian community, feel like it's actually a lack of faith to go back to understanding your past, that you're dishonoring your family, that you're just airing dirty laundry. And so you'll address that directly, which I think is really helpful as well. And then we'll do some exercises around those things, and then go into what emotions in the present tell you about your past story, triangulation. And then ultimately, our hope is to get you a bit closer into your story and then help you understand how healing happens, how you move into a truer telling of your story as you get closer to it, move into grief, anger, rage, and then really what it looks like to have kindness and grace towards yourself and your families and your systems, as you move through healing. Healing should help you become a more solid, kind, centered, loving human being.
And the reason that we're calling this a workshop instead of a conference is that you are going to, if you participate in this, you're going to do work on your story during the day itself, on that Saturday. So there will be 2 sections of time carved out for you to do some work. We'll give you the tools to do it, these handouts that will help you actually begin to do or continue to do work on your family of origin story. By the end of the workshop, here are 3 things that will have happened. Number 1, I think you will have a good understanding of why exploring and understanding your story is essential for healing and growth. Number 2, I think you will have made linkages between your present day-to-day life, your present emotional experiences, and your past experiences, particularly in your family of origin. I think you will have a sense of some of the linkages between your experience of life today and where that stuff is coming from in your past story. And then the third thing that will have happened is you will have done some work on your story, because we're going to give you these 2 exercises that will help you make sense of your past experiences.
So Adam, as you've been doing, you and I have been doing story work for a long time now, and I've done work on your story, you've done work on my story, we've done work with lots of different people. How is this playing out in your life still? Because I would say for me, I'm not done. I've been doing story work for about 18 years, and at every single round I lean back into around my story, there is more and more depth, richness, more insight that I find at every round. And so I think, even for those of you who have done a lot of story work, every single time you step back into it intentionally, I find that there's a new revelation. And the more story work you do, the more of the depths that you can descend into, because there's been covered ground already. And that's been so true to me. So even I look at the last 2 years of my life, and I've been able to reach deeper into my story than I ever have before, because I've done so much work prior. So it's still really important to me. Like, I don't think I'll ever be done doing this work. How about you?
Well, you shared about your marriage. I can share my corollary to that. In marriage counseling with my wife, Caroline, over the years, something that routinely comes up is her desire that I would pursue her heart more frequently, more intentionally, pursue her heart. Now, this has always kind of puzzled me, because whenever she says it, and I mean like over 10 or 15 years of marriage, like this has come up many times. And on the one hand, I'm always so puzzled, because it's like, I kind of do that for a living very naturally with lots and lots of people. And whenever she says that, I'm like, I want to do that for you. Like, I want to do that more for you than anyone else. That's what comes up inside of me. And so it begs the question of like, well, what's going on that she has to keep asking for that when A, I'm good at it, and B, like, I want to do that for her. And so one of the times that came up this year, I journaled about it like the next morning. And one of the things that I realized was I hated having to tend to and pursue my mother's heart as a boy. It was a requirement, unstated, but very, very clear, that when my mom needed care, and even when she didn't, like, it was my task to pursue her, to ask her how she was, to see how her day was, to see how her heart was, to check in with her. And I was not able to be a son, a boy, a kid, because I had this job. So when I met Caroline, my wife, I was very uninterested in continuing that job description.
Right.
And one of the reasons I chose her was because I felt like and sensed that she would not require that of me like my mother had been.
Mm-hmm.
The dilemma with that is like she's a woman with a heart and she needs to be cared for and pursued by her husband. And so this is that category of reenactment. My refusal to pursue Caroline's heart, or even, yes, refusal, but it's even, there's something of like, I'm not even aware, or I don't even think in that category. And yet, I pursue people's hearts like all day long, all the time, love it, feel very comfortable doing it. How is it that my own wife doesn't benefit from my gifting? I mean, it's like if you're a gourmet chef and you never cook a meal for your spouse.
Right.
Right? Like you just got to tilt your head and be like, how is that happening?
And what I hear in that story is, one, the sense of desire and grief around it. But also, that's not one of those things that you just can pull yourself up by your bootstraps and then decide, I'm going to pursue my wife's heart. I mean, you can try, but it doesn't work. And she can feel the inauthenticity of it. Because if you train yourself to say, okay, when she comes home, I'm going to ask her, how's your day, honey? We read each other's bodies and minds and faces really well. So you can read her and you know what she wants from you. And she reads you and knows that you don't actually want to give it to her, right? Even if you feign that you do. And that's not what she wants. That's not what either of you want. So, there is that sense of do you know why you're triggered? Because even in that moment, like when you see her face and her desire for you to engage, you are immediately brought back to your mother, whether you want to believe that or not. And so then the work is, can you tend to that little boy and allow him a way to settle his body, to connect with him, to let him rage and grieve and feel the weight of being a surrogate spouse to his mom in a way that was so damaging and harmful. And then as you do that, you're going to be able to come to her. I mean, the hope, right, is that you're going to be able to then have authentic intimacy and desire between the two of you that's based on care of that triggered part of you, not denial of it. And I think so many of us, because we're like, well, we're supposed to care for our spouse this way, so we deny what's going on and then work harder to be the people we think we should be in that moment. And it's just not an authentic way of living. And that always will bring exhaustion, resentment, contempt. And those are killers for a relationship and for ourselves. And so I love that example because it really brings home the idea of why it's so important to understand what's going on beneath the surface so that you can then engage in a different way. And even for her to know that. Yes. Because that's part of it, is us being able to be honest and say, so for my husband and I have similar dynamics, different than your guys's, but where if he's desiring something from me and it puts me straight back into my abuse story. And so that's my job, is to be able to say, okay, I actually do want intimacy and goodness between the two of us, but I'm triggered. I need to figure out why. I need to hold on to that little girl. I need to understand what's going on in my body. But then I also need him to be able to say, hey, my guess is that you're probably pretty triggered right now. How can I be with you? And how can we find another way forward? But if you don't know yourself and know your story, you're not going to be able to do any of that. Okay, so that was fun. As we end, a reminder, Saturday, November 19th, Understanding Your Story Workshop, virtual via Zoom.
You can go to my website, adamyoungcounseling.com, and the registration page is right there. It's the homepage. So right there, adamyoungcounseling.com, you can sign up, and we hope to see you there. Thanks, Cathy.
Thank you, Adam. It's good to be here.